Welcome to Board with Paint's vast The Mysterious Manor painting series. Today we'll be painting the Sorcerer. This series is primarily geared towards beginners, so if you want an overview of the equipment we'll be using, take a look at episode 1. I'll put the link in the description below. I've already prepared the miniature for painting by scraping off mold lines and filling in gaps with some plastic putty. So without further ado, let's look at the steps we'll take to bring this miniature to the tabletop. As always, we'll start by priming the miniature to give the paint a good surface to adhere to. Then we'll paint on base colors, followed by some shade and highlights. We'll apply some dark lining to bring out the details, and we will finish this miniature off by painting the base and applying a matte varnish to protect the miniature during gameplay. As in the previous episode, we'll start by priming the miniature, doing a spray of black followed by a spray of white from directly above will bring out the raised areas, giving us a guideline for where to add our highlights later. I'm using an airbrush for this, but you can use a spray-on primer that you get from a craft store. It works just as well. Now we'll lay down the foundation and paint in some base colors. We'll start off by painting the skin with some Sharpnel Red. When painting the hands, we're going to stay away from the fingertips. Those are going to be painted blue later, and then at a later step, we're going to blend those two colors together. Next, we'll use Mephiston Red from Citadel to paint the coat and upper parts of the clothes. To paint the dress and darker parts of the clothing, I decided to go with Bloodfest Crimson. This ended up being a little too purple, so I decided to mix it with some of the Mephiston Red and reapply it to the darker parts of the clothes. We'll hit the back of the cape with this, but we'll stay away from that trim. We're going to hit that with a brighter red later on. We're also going to use this color to paint these tassel-y things, whatever they are. We're going to leave the edges untouched because we want to blend that into some blue later on. We're also going to paint the boots with this color. Let's move on to the sleeves with Vallejo's Flat Flesh mixed with a little bit of thinner medium. This color can go on a little thick, so we use the thinner to help eliminate the brush strokes. We'll paint the sleeves and the trim with this, as well as the buttons on the coat. We don't need to be too precise at this point. Later on we'll add some dark lining and it'll really clean those edges up. If we got a little sloppy with the flat flesh, we can go in with some Mephiston Red and clean up those lines a little. And while we have the Mephiston Red on our brush, we'll hit the trim on the back of the cape with it. Also paint the wrists with the Mephiston Red. Here I'm going back to the red and crimson mix and cleaning up some more of the yellow trim. Now we're going to paint the hair with some Vallejo model color black gray. As in the previous episode, we're using a gray here rather than just a straight black, because this gives us the ability to shade it down and allow the gray to act as a highlight, even though we do want the final effect to be black hair. Now we're going to use Scalecolor Amarth Blue, and we're going to hit the fingertips and the edges of the tassels with this. We don't need to go for a really smooth blend here, we can deal with that later. For now, we're just sketching out where we want the blue to be and where we want the red to end. Try to at least overlap the red a little bit with your blue, that'll help us blend it down later. Apply a couple of coats of this to make sure that the blue covers really well. Now we'll use some pink horror to pick out the eyes. We'll go in and hit the earrings with some Arbuckles Brown from Scalecolor. I used Orcish Dermis to paint the pink streak in the hair, and Sky Gray to paint the white streak. I apologize I wasn't able to get a good shot of me painting this on camera. Now we're going to blend the blue and the red together on the tassels. We'll do this by creating a midtone by putting our Mephiston Red and Crimson mix together with some of the blue. Thin this down and apply it over the transitional area between the two colors. Make sure you leave some of the original colors on either side. You just want the purple in the middle. Create a mid-tone for the hands by mixing Sharpnel Red with the blue. We'll apply this the same way, but we'll keep the area pretty small since the fingers are not very long. Here we're going to use some very thinned down blue to finish off the transition. Start your brush strokes in the purple and bring the brush out to the edge of the blue where that color is most intense. Let it dry completely and do this a few more times, each time covering a smaller and smaller area. You should gradually see that transition start to fade away. And we'll repeat this process with the red and crimson mix. Make sure the paint's very thin, start from the purple, and go out into the red. The more layers you apply, the smoother that gradient should look in the end. Repeat this with the Sharpnel Red on the hands. This is where I decided to stop, but you could definitely make the transitions even smoother by applying more layers. Next, we'll bring out some more of the details by adding some shades and highlights. First, we'll apply some Carroburg Crimson to bring some depth to the shadows. This can be applied directly out of the pot to all the red areas of the model. Be careful around the blues and the yellow trim. You don't want this shade to stain those colors. You can use this shade to reinforce transition areas between the tassels or between the skin and the clothes. Make sure you allow the shade to dry completely before adding any paint over top of it. Now we're going to add a highlight to the hair using a mix of the black gray with sky gray. We'll use a fine detail brush and we'll try to pick out all the individual strands of hair that are sculpted onto this character's head. This can be a bit tedious, so if you'd rather complete this step faster, you could achieve a very similar result by using a dry brush, which I cover in episode 1. Here I'm adding a little bit more of the sky gray to our mix. We're going to apply this to the top parts of the hair where it would be catching the most light. Here we'll highlight the skin by adding a little bit of Orcish Dermis to the Sharpnel Red. We'll start with the face. There's not a lot of protruding parts like a nose or cheekbones, so I just went for highlighting down the middle on the forehead and a little around the mouth. We'll use this to highlight the darker part of the hands as well. We'll add a little more Orcish Dermis to our mix and repeat this process, covering a slightly smaller area. We'll highlight the darker parts of the clothing by adding some Orcish Dermis to our red mix that we used earlier. We're going to try drawing the paint up from the darkest areas into the place where we want the brightest highlights. Remember, the most paint gets deposited where your brush leaves the miniature. We'll focus these highlights on the upturned surfaces that are in most direct path of the light. Hit all of the raised folds in the bottom of the dress with this color, staying out of the deeper recesses. Repeat this a few more times. Every time you do, cover slightly less fabric than you did the previous one. This will let you gradually build up the intensity of those highlights. And And let's not forget to highlight the boots. We'll hit the toes and the raised parts of the boots with this color. Carefully pick out the ridges on the top of the shoulder, keeping out of the recesses. Here we'll add an edge highlight to the red part of the tassels. If you use the side of the brush, this will go a lot easier. We're going to boost these areas of highlight a little further by adding more Orcish Dermis to the mix. Just like the previous layers, we're going to cover a slightly smaller portion of the fabric. I'm reserving this step for the areas of the cloak that are going to be receiving the most light. We'll hit those shoulder ridges again with this color to really make them pop. I'm using this color to do some edge highlighting around the collar, and we'll also do the red part of the tassels again. Now we'll move on to highlighting the areas of pure red. We'll start off just using the base tone, Mephiston Red. Next we'll mix in some Evil Sunz Scarlet from Citadel. Hit these red areas again, covering a slightly smaller area just as before. Now we'll brighten this up by adding a little bit of Wild Rider Red to the mix. This will go where we want our very brightest highlights on these red portions of fabric. With the red highlighting done, we'll move on to highlighting the blue. We'll start off by mixing some Hiril Blue from Scalecolor into the original blue that we used for the blue parts of the tassels and the fingertips. Focus these highlights on the edges of the blue and stay away from the red transitions. We'll apply this blue highlight in a couple of layers, again covering slightly less area each time to create a nice smooth transition. Here's how we're looking after that stage of highlighting. Now we'll shade the hair using Citadel's Nuln Oil. You can apply this directly from the pot over the entire area of hair. This will pull into the recesses and provide contrast with the highlights we added earlier. For the yellowish portions of the miniature, we'll use Agrax Earthshade. We can also shade the skin with this, so hit the hands and the more recessed parts of the face with it. Let a generous amount pool in the mouth recess to really bring it out. Use this to darken around the eyes, especially near the top. Now we'll mix flat yellow and ivory to apply a non-metallic metal effect to the earrings. To really sell the metal effect, you need to go from a very dark color, which is our Arbuckles Brown, to a very bright highlight over a very short distance. Here I've decided to apply the yellow on 3 different light points, one in front, one in back, and one around where the earring meets the ear. Keeping the paint thinned down with water will help it blend in with the base color. We'll apply several layers of this, each time adding more ivory to the yellow, and we'll cover a slightly smaller area each time. The process is not much different from the way we were highlighting the red and the blue earlier. It's just that we're trying to achieve the transition over a much smaller area than we did before. To help the transition, we'll glaze in some of the original Arbuckles Brown. Mix this in with some water, get it really thin, and then wick some off on a paper towel before you touch it to the miniature. Brush this from the edge of the yellow down into the darker parts of the brown. Once we're happy with the look of the gold, we'll add some pure ivory spots in the center of each light point. This has a very antique look to the gold. If you wanted a brighter gold, you could use a lighter brown instead of Arbuckles Brown as a starting point. Now we'll highlight the arms and the yellow trim using the base color Flat Flesh. We can use the original base color because we added a shade to this, which tinted the existing color down a little bit. To go brighter with these highlights, we'll add some ivory. We'll brighten this up in a couple of stages and start to add some highlighting to the trim. In many places, this is almost an edge highlight, so you can get away with using the side of the brush. We can brighten up the buttons on the coat with this as well. I decided to brighten the highlights up a little bit on the face, so I'm mixing some ivory in with the brightest highlight that we used and reapplying around the mouth and the forehead, just trying to bring out some of the more prominent features of the face since it is so flat. I think that looks a lot nicer. While we have this bright highlight color out, we'll also do the knuckles and upper parts of the hands as well. To help transition the highlights into the skin, I'm going to mix some of the base color Sharpnel Red with some Vallejo Glaze medium. Get this nice and thin with medium, and then wick off the excess liquid on a paper towel. We'll brush this from the highlighted areas down into the shadows. The end result is a very subtle effect, so feel free to skip this step if you'd like. We can apply this to the hands as well to tone down some of the transitions between the highlight and shadow. Now it's time to really bring out the details by adding some dark lining. We'll do this by adding some black ink and some Arbuckles Brown to a little bit of water. Use a paper towel to wick off any excess liquid from the brush. This is very important because we don't want this to necessarily pool in the recesses. We want the application to be very controlled. This is basically going to go everywhere there is a transition between different types of fabric, between skin and clothing, between the tassels, between the face and the hair, anywhere where one element touches another element. Take your time with this and go slow. Dark lining can be quite challenging, but I think the extra pop it adds to the miniature is well worth it. You could consider this step optional, but I encourage you to give it a try and see how it turns out, even if you aren't feeling that confident in it. You can also use this to deepen the shadows in places where you want to increase the contrast, like I'm doing here on the shoulder ridges. Here I'm adding a dark line along the trim on the back of the cape. Adding a dark line between two colors of a similar hue, like the two reds on the back of this cape, help to provide visual separation between those two elements and will make them much more visible when looking at it from a distance when it's on the tabletop. I'm dark lining between these two parts of the yellow that are very close together. That will help separate them and will clean up any rough edges we had with the yellow. I'm being a bit liberal with this, where the neck meets the inside of the collar, since that area will be in heavy shadow. I'm using this on the inside of the mouth just to give it a little more definition. To bring the eyes out a bit more, I am also adding lining around those. Here's a quick look at where we're at. I wanted to bring out the highlights of the trim of the cape a little bit more, so I'm going with some pure Evil Sunz Scarlet here and reinforcing those areas of brightest highlight. This is mostly just going to be on the corners. Then I decided to reinforce the highlights of the other pure red parts of the clothes. We'll add a glint to the eyes by adding a spot of pure ivory to the upper left corner of each one. You can see this gives the illusion that the eyes are a reflective surface. The gems around the belt area I painted similarly to the eyes off camera. I am adding a dot of ivory to those as well to give them a glint. We'll wrap this up by painting the base and applying a protective varnish. For gameplay reasons, I'm going to paint the base the same color as the character's pieces. Here I'm laying down 2 coats of Evil Sunz Scarlet. To finish it off, we'll paint the rim of the base with pure black. To add a little bit of separation between the model and the base, we'll go back to our dark lining mix of the black ink and Arbuckles Brown and trace around the feet with it. Finally, we'll protect the miniature with a quick application of Tester's spray lacquer. And that wraps up the Sorcerer. Thank you for watching Board with Paint. I hope this was helpful. If it was, please like and subscribe. and click the bell icon so you're notified whenever I release a new video. And of course, until next time, happy painting!